Okay, all right. Yes, yeah. All right, yes. Let's carry on. Dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Attila Da, and I would like to welcome to you another EuraTalk online program hosted by Universal Rights Association. Universal Rights Association is a civil society organization dedicated to promoting and protecting human rights, the rule of law, democracy, peace, and sustainable development prescribed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. URA focuses on creating awareness and advice solutions on social issues, freedom, injustice, and human rights abuses which affects the daily life of people. As you know, today is 3rd of May, which is a World Press Freedom Day, and we will be talking about interaction between media freedom, if there is any interaction between media freedom and COVID-19. We have very important high-ranked media experts, editors, and journalists who I will introduce to you now. But before we carry on, I would like to make an announcement that please feel free to share your comments, ask questions via Zoom chat or via our Facebook page. Yes, I would like to start with Mary Papaya. Mary is an executive director on the board of South African Broadcasting Corporation, SABC, and chair of the News and Editorial Subcommittee. She was appointed to serve on the board by the Parliament in 2019. Mary is a founder and editor and former Secretary General and Deputy Chair of the South African National Editors Forum, SANEF, where she is currently serves as the chair of the Media Freedom Committee. She also sits on the board of the South African Press Council. She almost has a 3 decades career in media with lots of success, but I would like to mention as a last introduction about her, she was the regional general manager of the Times Media Group as the first female journalist to be appointed into this position in South Africa. Mary, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would like to carry on to alphabetic order, according to alphabetic order, as well as the rule of the ladies first. I would like to come to Judy Sanderson. Judy, during a long career at SABC as broadcast journalist, gender activist, and its first female provincial editor. Again, that today we have another first female head in the private and public media. Judy Sanderson led parity campaigns for staffers and pioneered a unique election code of conduct for politicians and media to ensure journalists' safety during the politician turbulence in KwaZulu-Natal. I'm sure that most of you will remember that turbulence. In 1994, she was appointed to lead the countrywide transformation of SABC Radio News and on its 18 radio services, and later founded several award-winning digital news services in sub-Saharan Africa for the public broadcaster. A founder editor of SANEF, she is currently its KwaZulu-Natal convener and serves on its management, Media Freedom and Diversity Committee, and she is also a Press Council adjudicator. Judy, thank you so much for being us this afternoon.
Lovely to be with you on this very important day. Thank you, Attila.
Thanks a lot. I will carry on according to alphabetic order again that Levent Kennes, he's joining us from Sweden. Levent Kennes has also a longer career in journalism. He is former editor-in-chief of Turkey's Meydan daily newspaper, which has been shut down by force later by the government, and he had to flee to Sweden by Turkish government. He had to flee to Sweden later on. He is currently Secretary General of Stockholm Freedom Center and journalist of Nordic Monitor. Levent, thank you so much for joining us today. And I finally would like to carry on with William Bird. William worked in television. After completing his studies, he first started working part-time with Media Monitoring Africa by 1995, long time. He later joined to MMA after leaving television. At MMA, William has overseen or been directly involved in over 100 media monitoring projects on subjects ranging from gender-based violence, HIV, and racism to children and the media. William has also completed overseeing the data analysis of the biggest civil society media monitoring exercise in the world. William was appointed as Ashoka Fellow in 2009 and also Link Fellow in 2010 for his work focused on children's participation in the media. William's knowledge of media monitoring and commitment to deepening democracy in South Africa and the continent has ensured his expertise is internationally recognized. William, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm just double checking. William, you can hear us and you're unmuted, am I right? I think you are muted. Can I ask?
There, it says I'm now unmuted. It says my host had muted me, so I thought it was he didn't want to get to me. It's okay.
On today, media freedom, I mean, World Press Freedom Day, we can't mute anybody. So you definitely will, sorry, it was a technical problem. Can you also check with Levent Ken as well if he himself did or he is also unmuted? Okay, thank you so much. As you all know, the world of humanity is battling to contain the pandemic, and the governments all around the world are taking some measurements which seriously changes the daily life. Millions of lives directly affected by the virus and hundreds of thousands of lives got lost, unfortunately. The health and the well-being of all should take the priority during these difficult times. As we said earlier, today is 3rd of May, World Press Freedom Day declared by United Nations General Assembly in early 90s. Free media, as one of the main pillars of democracy, has always been important. But access to free and accurate information came vital, especially these extraordinary times, and we believe that we must pay extra attention to media freedom. To understand the effect of media freedom and tackle the challenges we will be talking about, that I will just try to give you a hint that what we'll be talking about today, that do media freedom and transparency affect the spread and the impact of COVID-19? Or do COVID-19 and restrictions taken by governments affect media freedom and transparency? What are the challenges of access to free and accurate information today? How much or should media be free after this pandemic for the safety of the people all around the world? And how should the balance be between accessing to information and make news, especially from social media perspective, and what are the challenges? The access to information and fake news, especially from social media perspective, and what are the challenges that especially that I will ask William to really give us information. But I would like to turn to our speakers and we'll try to give them and ask questions, but I would like them to consider these also topics when they are answering, that we will have 2 rounds. The first round for everyone will be 7 minutes, and then later on we will go for this second round, which will be 3 minutes for each speaker. And then later on we will check our Zoom chat as well as our Facebook page to see that if we have any questions or any comments that we will try to also address. So I'd like to turn to our speakers now. I would like to start with Judy. Judy, can you please give us a background of media freedom in South Africa, especially in the state of broadcasting company, SABC, as a former regional head? How was it been in the past, how do you see it today? And if you can also cover the last 2 months as well. So yes, Judy.
Right. When I started with the SABC as a young reporter in 1974, I was passionate about radio news and reaching people with stories, and I loved radio, but I had no idea. I was very naive then. I didn't realize how bad the climate of repression and fear and censorship was in the SABC. And my work as a gender activist in the townships in Pietermaritzburg, where I was working as a young reporter, but at the same time, I was setting up Pietermaritzburg Rape Crisis to assist survivors of rape, and especially those in detention who were getting abused, especially women. And it was really strange to have those two lives. And in a way, everything we did, you could report on ordinary things, but for example, the word rape wasn't allowed on SABC radio news. And I had to fight to try, especially with my coverage of violence against women and children, to get that word used. And then, for example, I did a special report over a few days in the Easter holidays on the Carnegie Inquiry into Poverty, Part 2. The first Carnegie Inquiry had been into the poverty of Afrikaners many years ago. And the second one was into the plight of poverty-stricken Black South Africans. And I did a full-length special report interviewing people like Mampela Rampela, and maybe fairly controversial, but really very topical, very important. And that was censored completely. They've refused to broadcast it. And when I did an investigative expose into King Edward VIII Hospital, which is at the time mainly serving Black patients, and was in a terrible state, especially the unit for children, the Burns unit, it was broadcast on a morning radio program, and then the Minister of Health complained to SABC and said they mustn't rebroadcast it that afternoon, which is how the special reports were normally done on radio today. And when, fortunately, some courage was arriving there in the 80s, and the news head said, no, we are going to rebroadcast, and then they had decided they would give 500 million rand to the hospital to fix it up, and would we please mention that? So in the early days, it was very hard to report on everything that was happening. The censorship, the fear, the security police would follow me in some of the things I did. You know, they'd listen to your phones, even to parties. We always knew who they were. So but I was obviously very fortunate. I never got attacked. So I only got beaten up once or twice, and I was fine. But obviously a lot of activists, political activists more so, really did. And then you have to remember too, there was a lot of discrimination within the staff. And when I first became a news editor, I discovered huge disparities in salaries between Black staff, Black and women staff, and white male staff. So I started campaigning against all that. And then I sued the SABC for an unfair labor practice in 1989, because they were taking benefits away from women and Black staff, Black and Indian staff. And just before the hearing, the board scrapped all discrimination against all employees, and we all got equal benefits. So I was warned that I'd be fired for that, obviously, but luckily Lawyers for Human Rights assisted me, and I didn't get help from the Staff Association I was a member of at the time, but that showed that the winds of change were coming in '89. And you have to look at SABC before 1919, when it was very repressed and stories were very rigidly controlled, and it was very difficult to push the boundaries. You had to really push, and you often didn't succeed. But between 91 and 99 was a wonderful honeymoon period of SABC, where we as editors had autonomy to be professional, to really transform our newsrooms, and to really start reporting far more community issues. And between 91 and 99, that was our heyday, really. Unfortunately, we got unethical leaders and boards after that, which led to the SABC going backwards again. And it took the bravery of the SABC 8 journalists who stood up to the unethical leaders and others supporting them to help turn things around and to get a new board today. And today, I see the phoenix is rising again. SABC is a very powerful, important organization, critical to our democracy, and the reach of its radio news stations in particular, radio news services, across rural and urban areas is very powerful and very credible. And now you see it rising again with sound leaders, an ethical and hardworking board, and dedicated news teams. And I believe in this current crisis in particular, you can see SABC journalists and editors really doing well in telling the story to the nation, and from government to the nation, and from the nation back to government. And I feel despite all its challenges around funding and still vestiges of interference, etc., by some people trying to interfere, you're always going to get politicians trying to interfere with the public broadcaster, but you have editors that stand firm and stand their ground and are professional at all times, and then you're going to have a credible news service, which we have today. And despite the other challenges around technology, sustainability, and funding, there's no doubt that the SABC news teams have risen to the occasion and are covering the COVID-19 crisis with bravery and courage, and other teams as well from other broadcasters and newspapers have really shown the value of journalism in a democracy and in a time of crisis. And I really hope that citizens realize that when we talk about media freedom is your freedom, it's our freedom. It's not just for journalists, it's for our democracy, for every citizen. If you don't have access to truth and access to information, you cannot make informed decisions about your daily lives. So it's a really critical thing to have.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Judy. I'd like to come to you, Mary. Oh, and yes, Mary, I have two questions to you. That one, can you please tell us on how is media freedom in a non-state company, as you have the experience? And is there any difference between public broadcasting or the private? And the secondly, as Sanaf Media Freedom Committee Chair, do you think have COVID-19 regulations affected media freedom today in South Africa? If so, what are the challenges during the pandemic? Mary? Oh, yes. Yeah. You are unmuted, but I can't hear you. I don't know why. You check your connection just in case. Live stream, that happens.
Right, I've removed it. So let's look at it. To answer your first question, I think it's important to understand what governs media freedom under the South African context. If we look at the South African Constitution, media freedom is protected and enshrined. In terms of the role of private media and independent media, I think it's important to understand that in pre-94, it was this particular media that was the lifeblood of telling the stories that were untold. In a stranglehold of under apartheid, we found that the stories that came out of the private sector entities and the independent media kept the voices of the unheard voices of people alive, telling the truth of what was happening in the townships. And obviously under such stranglehold, journalists did come under fire. At that time, we must be quite clear, it was an advocacy era. Journalists like myself found ourselves playing an advocacy role and coming under attack and being at the front line of the force of the apartheid government was a natural scenario. We accepted it. There were arrests. We were followed through. I think Judy spoke a lot about the terrain at the time. So rewind to post-94, and comes the issue of the Constitution, far-reaching, media freedom is protected, and we have a whole lot of unbundling of what was then state-controlled media. That further reinforced the role of media under a democratic dispensation. We found a whole lot of mushrooming of independent media, a really very exciting time in the course of our history. But then we look to the last 11 years, a decade that unfortunately took us back many years to the pre-94 dispensation. We found issues like state capture being unearthed. And here I think is where we celebrate the role of private media. We saw it lead to the commissions, the State Capture Commission, the Zander Commission, and for the first time in our history, post the 94 rainbow democracy, we're starting to find the truth around what happened in the last 11 years. Now, fast forward to COVID-19, and you asked, what is happening? Certainly from a perspective of media reporting, media is playing a frontline role in the COVID-19 response. And even though the pandemic itself has had a devastating impact on the industry, on journalism, we're seeing some incredible areas of excellence across all media platforms. We're seeing journalists themselves leveling the playing fields, because what COVID has done for us is basically said to journalists and to media, there's no such thing as scoop. So this leveling of the playing field is something that has basically conscientized the role of media under a crisis, within a pandemic, and the role of the media in conscientizing and making people aware of it. And then we rewind to Press Freedom Day, commemorated today under extraordinary circumstances that we've never experienced before. And I think, to quote the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, he said, the press provides the antidote to verified, scientific, fact-based news and analysis. And we have certainly seen this in South Africa, and we're seeing it around the world. From the perspective of what is needed so that journalists can work in a free and fair environment, I think it's important to understand that access to information around the COVID pandemic, as is on any other news day, is vital. There has to be information around the pandemic that is free of any control whatsoever. And we saw in the beginning, and I think that was addressed certainly by organizations like ours, SANAF, and other groups, MMA, and a whole host of entities, where government was asked to provide information that will basically assist in the Saving Life protests. Now, going forward, what we need is to see the challenges addressed. What have journalists been experiencing under COVID-19? In terms of the lockdown regulations, we've seen the safety of journalists come under huge challenge, particularly in areas of under intense control by the ground troops, the SNDF, the SAPS. We've had journalists having to abort their assignment because they were prevented from covering their stories. We also saw journalists, including the SABC journalists, come under attack by police who opened fire on crowds. Journalists was hospitalized, had to seek treatment for that. We've seen in the courts under stories relating to COVID-19 where journalists are prevented from covering those stories. And then online, the trolling of journalists, particularly female journalists, continue. And I think those are some of the critical areas that we have to focus on. But I think most importantly is the financial challenge. The drop in advertising has meant that the newsrooms are under critical danger. So if you look at certain media entities in South Africa, under COVID-19, trimming of salaries have been essential, and finding new and creative ways of doing sustainable business has been something that had to be looked at. So that is a critical area we need to look at. And I'm sure William will talk about the misinformation that we're seeing and how that's going to impact on media. Overall, I think the economic devastation is something that's real. We have to look at it. We've seen a pioneering entity in the magazine industry shut its doors in South Africa. A formidable a news entity, Mail and Guardian, is facing the same future. So these are the areas that we need to be mindful of, and we need, in totality, an environment and a climate that is conducive to free and fair reporting based on the constitutional mandate. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Mary. William, I would like to come to you. You are the Director of Media Monitoring Africa. Can you please tell us on what are the challenges of media freedom, especially can you compare the South Africa to the continent, the other African countries? But I want you to just give us broader information, especially on how the situation particularly in social media, in the social platforms, how can we, by the way, we also have lots of fake news which has been created by, we don't know who, but it's just becoming quite viral. And how can we stop this fake news in media, as well as social media, without giving any damage to media freedom? Just one moment. Yes. Yeah.
So, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hello. Okay, good. Sorry. Thanks. So, yeah, fascinating insights from our two previous speakers. So South Africa is in a very good position relative to the rest of the continent, actually. If you just look at our neighbors, aside from Namibia, which I think is another beacon of light in what is otherwise a very dark period in relation to media freedom. Mozambique, which is just on our border, has got a very poor track record around media freedom, especially at the moment. We know about Swaziland, also got some significant challenges around media freedom. And then as you go up, you'll find that you see increasing numbers of internet shutdowns being used as a general tactic by governments these days, because they realize the increasing influence and power of social and digital media, potentially to get access to voices that they otherwise haven't seen or heard. So for a lot of them, because they haven't made that transition to actually allow, or certainly even potentially allow, a public service broadcaster, which is fundamental to this crisis we're in, right? And if you look at the research that is emerging from some of these global studies, the public broadcasters around the world are the ones that people are turning to in significant numbers for the most accurate, reliable information, because that's what people need, right? And because we have so few of those, literally a handful on our entire continent, it really is something quite incredible that then the way that these states tend to deal with this is that they see internet shutdown as a legitimate means of trying to silence dissent, because that tends to be where people are going. And even then, we know, as we do in parts of Europe, like Turkey, as a clear example of how people are able to operate now effectively within their nation, but outside of their nation. We've got a number of people from Zimbabwe, for example, who use the power of social media to be able to do that. So it does have that incredible ability to allow for greater communication and participation and democratic expression. But equally, I think, and this is, one of the other guests have highlighted the massive danger that our media sector's in globally as a result of the financial constraints. But that disinformation, mis and disinformation is as dangerous and as much of a threat as, in fact, the virus is to all of us. Precisely because it doesn't just undermine media freedom, it undermines media, basic knowledge and information. It leaves people in a position where they're unable to act. And the moment you can't act because you can't make an informed decision, that's no longer a democratic state. So you said at the start of your question, what could we do to challenge and counteract some of these things? Right. I mean, an obvious one would be to get a new leader in America, because he's one of the greatest proponents of mis and disinformation, and certainly attacking media freedom on a routine basis. And it's important we highlight this on Media Freedom Day. it's an astonishing thing that for someone who's ruling an established centuries-old democratic state, that they have someone who is so profoundly opposed to media freedom in so many respects, that he uses this term of fake news to undermine the credibility of the media, and that, I think, is profoundly dangerous. We are seeing a number of things. Are the social media platforms doing enough? Well, I'm not so sure. You know, to some degree they do, but to a large degree, I don't think that they're doing anywhere near enough to do things to combat that. What we're doing in South Africa is we've got a platform, it's a complaints platform, where people are allowed to submit complaints in order to expose what's going on. And we've had a number of complaints dealing with really interesting things. Some of them are just bizarre and from the lands of fruitcake, and you know, the sort of thing that COVID-19 is not really a virus. It's intended to, you know, it's invented by scientists so that they can implant vaccines and microchips in us as we go ahead. You know, so really off the wall, loopy things, to things that are even more dangerous and sinister. People trying to organize and oppose, you know, regulations that are clear and legitimate. So there's some very real threats there. But what we're trying to do is expose those things, make people be aware of them. Because the bizarre thing about social media and its relationship to media freedom is that, in as much as there's so much of it, because there's so much of it, you're only able to focus on a small portion. And that portion is usually determined by an algorithm that is set by one of the major platforms. So in fact, in as much as you think you can see and hear everything, you're only exposed to a tiny fraction of that. And so being able to expose what is mis and disinformation and where it's circulating and how, and expose people to the fact that it's there, is a critical part of you know, moving into a new digital and journalistic media freedom era, I guess, which is where we're going now.
Yes, right. Thank you so much, William. Leventkin, I would like to come to you. You have a long experience of media and media freedom in the Middle East. As someone whose newspaper shut down by force, and now you live in Sweden, and we know that most of your career you were also in covering Middle East as well as being in Turkey. Can you please give us a broader international view on how did COVID-19 affect media freedom as you are in Europe, as well as the Middle East? And there are some critical countries that, for example, that people, in fact, that we will come to that, but one of them is that people are complaining about China, and also that in terms of the manipulating numbers that they also complain, Turkey as well. So how was the situation in Europe and the Middle East? Can you please give us some information about that?
Sure. Thank you very much for the invitation. Greetings from Stockholm. It's nice to be with you this Sunday. I'm a Turkish journalist living in Stockholm. You mentioned Attila. I don't want to repeat my personal story, but I'm a journalist in exile. My newspaper was shut down by the government. I was briefly detained in Turkey in 2016. So I found an opportunity to escape, and now for more than 40 years, I've been living in Stockholm, Sweden. Well, today I would like to tell you about what happened in Europe during these Corona days. But mostly I look forward to our next discussions, because in today's world, it's so easy to reach what happened, when happened, but what will be next is the key question. When we see the what happened in Europe, we can make it into 4 categories. First, of course, while mentioning Europe, Europe is not a homogeneous continent. There are some Eastern Europe countries that are quite problematic in terms of media freedom. But as a whole, Europe remains the continent that most ensures the freedom of press, according to many data. One of them is the World Press Freedom Index, I think you recall, prepared by Reporters Without Borders. Many European countries ranked as good, fairly good, and countries like I live in Sweden and Scandinavian countries registering very best scores. But as a whole country, when there are some reports also, there are some research indicated here in Europe, what's going on in Europe during these corona days, what we see is there are mainly four things. One is there are some emergency measures, excessive regulation against disinformation. Many countries did it, especially Eastern European countries. Secondly, restriction on access to information and the verbal and physical attacks to journalists, what we observe in Italy, and today there's one case in Germany, and fourth, surveillance and privacy threats. I would like to give examples. For example, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. These are problematic countries that I mentioned before in terms of media freedom. Passed legislations giving authorities very extraordinary power to remove reports, detain journalists, and even ban access to websites. So this is not good for the whole Europe, because when you're giving so much power to authority, you can't never know where it ends. And after current days, there are many concerns that these restrictions will be valid, even the pandemic will be over. As I told you, a number of journalists in Italy were insulted, harassed while doing their jobs in infected areas near hospitals. Well, as a Turkish citizen, I would like to tell about my country, because Turkey serves many examples about contraction between media freedom and pandemic. Firstly, Erdogan doesn't need any legislation to stop journalists doing their jobs, because thanks to presidential system, Erdogan has this authority, has already have this authority, so he doesn't need to pass any legislation bypassing parliament. So Erdogan is so powerful. Well, what we see is many journalists are detained and arrested. Let me look at my notes. What are these reasons? The reason is creating fear and panic amongst the public, inciting hatred and enmity. These are very classical head-ups by the authoritarian regimes. And one thing which is very important is that Turkey released 90,000 prison inmates in order for the pandemic, but no journalist was released. This is very sad for my colleagues and for my friends. Currently, there are 161 journalists behind bars in Turkey. Turkey is the worst jailer in the world in terms of jailing journalists.
Sorry,
so
Demet,
unfortunately,
I would like to just come in there. You said that 90,000 people have been released, but no journalists. So who were these
no
people
journalists.
that they released them?
Well, murderers, gang leaders, mafia leaders were released, but political leaders, journalists, academicians, housewives, lawyers that are labeled as threat to the government, labeled as opponents, are not released. They are still in prison. They are in danger. They are face to face with the pandemic spread. Unfortunately, our prayers are with them, because they have nothing wrong. Their only guilt is being an opponent to the government. I think South African, my colleagues know that very much historically. So we are really concerned about their health during this, because Turkish prisons are very crowded. Sometimes 20 people live in a cell, which is a capacity of 6 or 8. So the situation is quite terrible.
Mm.
And secondly, what happened in Turkey is that, for example, let's say critical TV were banned on 3 nights on prime time over anchors' critical comments while reporting the state's COVID policies. This is Fox TV, the Turkish affiliation of the international Fox, and also fined 3% of its advertisement revenues. These are happens. And secondly, I would like to give a very concrete example of what happened in Turkey. A group of journalists reported a corruption about a president's aide, about its building and a guard yard. It was illegally translated from the state. These journalists were detained or were investigated. Do you know what is the reason for that?
You know, carry on, please.
Yes, what happened? What reason? It's challenging Turkey's struggle against COVID. Turkey is very bright image in the world, coping with the COVID-19. So you are damaging our image. This is the result. This is the reason.
Okay, that's very interesting.
Mm.
Yeah. So this is unfortunately the situation that you mentioned in Turkey. And in terms of the numbers that we are also hearing, that some are complaining for some countries. For example, some people, we don't know it's exactly true, but I'm just trying to reflect the complaints that on Iran, for example, they said they are manipulating the numbers of. They talk about Turkey, they are manipulating numbers in the Middle East. So how true is this? Do you think that really government can or does manipulate these numbers, and for what reason?
Sure, Georgian is quite. The government is successful, is fighting with corona. That's the reason, and the figures are not transparent. You cannot check with the other resources. You cannot access information. You have to be satisfied with the number provided by the government. So you have no option to check with the others. The journalists who are trying to check are detained or threatened by the government. As I told you before, a news channel was banned 3 nights on prime time. So you don't have any tool to check. For example, you make a comparison between death numbers during the recent years. There's a very dramatic increase in the last year in 2020, but you cannot demand that, you cannot claim that it's because of corona. This is the situation in Turkey.
That's interesting.
Everybody knows there is a dramatic increase, but you cannot claim it's because of corona.
Mm. Thank you so much, Levent Kenes. So with Levent Kenes, we've completed the first round. For the second round, I would like to ask to our panelists that about something which is currently kind of unknown, but everyone is wondering about and taking guesses or making theories about the world after coronavirus. But I mostly ask about freedom and media freedom perspective, because quite a number of people are complaining, as I mentioned, that if there was a proper media freedom in China, where the virus first appeared, the world, they said, if there was a proper media freedom in China, the world would know early about COVID-19, and the spread would have given less damage to the rest of the world. So this is one of the ideas that people talk about. So I would like to ask, what kind of world you are expecting after the pandemic, especially on freedom, media freedom, and information security in the world? Can we start with you, Judy?
I think South Africa and the world are going to, media in South Africa and the world have to continue to be on their toes, because there's always organizations or governments or politicians who are trying to be more authoritarian or take more control or get their message across and not be questioned. That can happen, and have new legislation brought in. It is going to be more challenging. I think it is going to be a new normal. The world is not going to be the same. There's going to be much more emphasis, I think, on small business and people in their local communities a lot more for a long time to come. Not as much traveling, not as much big corporate stuff. But in terms of media freedom, it just means we have to be more vigilant, and because we're going to be facing the same economic pressures as other organizations, whether it's a public broadcaster or commercial media or community media. And it's going to be a question of survival in many ways. But what I've been really pleased and proud to see is that the true grit that has come out of the core, the smaller core, because we've lost thousands of jobs, journalist jobs and editor jobs in the last 10 years. And the journalist core reporting today, of course, no one is perfect. You're going to get a few wobbly journalists. You always get that. But we have our institutions in place, the Press Council, the Broadcasting Complaints Commission, etc., to take complaints. I do think we are seeing true grit and courage from the smaller group of journalists reporting multimedia, radio, television, online, digital, community radio, and newspaper and television. But it is going to be a smaller group, so there's going to be more responsibility to stay focused and true to our ideals and beliefs in order to truly serve our society and our democracy. So it's not going to be easy, but I have noticed that as a group also in the media, we've come together more closely. We are fighting in a more united way to do the right thing, to ensure there's professional and safe and true journalism. And I think that will continue, but it's going to be a smaller band, and we need all the support we can get from citizens, from sponsors, from anyone who can keep our core going.
Thank you so much, Judy. Mary, what are your ideas, thoughts about this?
Okay, can you hear me? Thanks. I think the issue of vigilance is very important, the monitoring of the space in which journalists operate in South Africa. But I think globally, it's important to understand, if we compare the nature of the environment in which South African journalists operate to the rest of the world, I think we're pretty much in a playing field that is free, or relatively free. So from that perspective, it's a good space. And I think the aspirations for our global colleagues should be to find that space and to focus on the areas that are impacting on the free flow of information. And it is going to require an absolute gigantic mountain of an effort, because what we've seen in the South African situation is that when you work under relatively free and fair, non-constrained conditions, you're able to tell the COVID-19 story far more aggressively and powerfully. So that's important. I think there are 4 key areas for me as we venture into this uncharted territory. Certainly technology is going to impact on how we do our jobs going forward. And the online digital era brings with it a whole lot of challenges, particularly from entities, individuals, and groupings that would want to curb freedom of expression. And I think, William, you have a lot of work on your hands going forward from that perspective. I think the safety of journalists, men and women, will remain critical going forward. We have to make sure that all precautions are taken, not just for the health of the journalists, because after COVID, in the event of there not being a vaccine, we're going to be dealing with the physical, the emotional, and the health hazards that journalists have had to work under. We know a lot of journalists themselves we've lost journalists globally. In South Africa, we've had journalists who have been infected. So this trauma around COVID-19 will be there for a long time. We need to find a way of bridging the gap between what's happening now and going forward. So the lives of journalists, very critical. We need to look at that. They've put their lives at risk. We need to acknowledge that. We must celebrate that, particularly today. We need to address the issues around ownership, particularly making sure that media remains free from political, from commercial, and from other influences. That's an absolute critical for us to, as media. Media in South Africa is the lifeblood of free media is the lifeblood of our democracy. Therefore, influence from any one position has to be guarded against. I think transformation is an issue we need to look at. Diversity, not just in the numbers and the faces, but I also think in leadership. Diversity in narratives. We need to, in South Africa and globally be given voice to the voiceless. Depending on ownership, it can create a skew in what kinds of news are coming through. So very important that we look at that. And access to information is critical. Issues around access to the internet. In poorer communities, the critical challenge for South Africa is free data. That's something we have to look at. Issues around poorer communities, the challenges they face, and how journalists come to grips with telling those stories. And lastly, I think misinformation poses a huge risk that will erode the trust in the public media. And I'm sure that's something William will also tackle going forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Mary. William, you are muted now.
Can you hear me now? So I think, I mean, I would agree with our first two, obviously. I think they made some excellent points. In addition to misinformation being there, I think we've already started to accept it as a new normal, you know, that half the things you receive on your device, and as much as it's your personal device, you are skeptical of, or at least you should be very skeptical of it, even if they come from your family members. So I think that that's going to be a new normal that we believe. I think that on a broader scale, you know, there's a good and a bad outcome potentially to this, and it really does depend on where things go. The good outcome is that for those that are already living under repressive regimes where their leaders lie to them consistently and they try and baffle them with bull, I think that what they're going to see is that actually, you know, they can lie and think they're going to get away with it, and they will, and they have, as we've seen in a number of countries currently, right? But that what will happen is that people's lived experience will ultimately go, well, you can tell me that there's no COVID-19, but actually my friend, my brother, my sister, my cousin, my aunt, my grandparents, they died from this. So don't tell us that it's not there and that it's not a big issue, right? That lived experience may well just be the thing that starts to set those countries on a new path. That the next time those leaders say that, they're just no longer going to believe them, because they're using that power to lie so much these days that ultimately it'll trip them up, you know, and they can lie as much as they like, but ultimately that reality will catch up with them. The downside is countries that have that level of freedom, you know, it is, if you look at the States, for example, in the UK, I'm really worried about the kind of trajectory that those nations are taking, where they see these things, they've got entrenched, deeply entrenched freedoms, and that they see this populist response, and that motivates and mitigates a far more totalitarian response to COVID virus and to the state in general, you know. So I think that there's some very real threats. In South Africa, you know, I think that there are going to be those people that will try and do bad things with the powers that they have, and that they'll use this to their advantage. But the good news is I think that there's a lot of people that are up to that fight, and we'll take them on in that fight in every way, shape and form that we possibly can. And we will not give that fight up, you know, lightly at any rate.
Yes.
I think that there's a lot of positive, there is some room for hope.
Yes, thank you so much. That's very important for a healthy democracy, that free media has to be there, and it has to be free. That's very, very vital. And finally, Levent, what is your opinion in terms of the second round?
Attila, I have two concerns. One is that most of the restrictions will be temporary. After the pandemic ends, these restrictions will be over. But I doubt some restrictions risk to be extended after the pandemic, especially Eastern European countries and some authoritarian countries will be very opportunist to extend these restrictions in the future. So I'm concerned about this. And secondly, the economic issue, unemployment is important, a challenge we're expecting, because many advertisers will face severe days in the future after the pandemic, also in this year. So that means advertising revenues will drop. So that many media outlets maybe will shut down or will be closed. So many journalists will be unemployed. This is one of the risks that we will challenge in the coming days.
Yes. Thank you so much. So I'm checking on one side that our chat, as well as that I think at the Facebook, we have one question which says that in South Africa there is a lack of data with respect to migration, especially in the context of scapegoating. It says that with COVID-19, the state only speaks to citizens. What role for the media is ensuring we have inclusive response to bend the curve? Can I just have your comment on this for half a minute of each, Judy?
I think the danger, of course, and we've had some history of some xenophobia in South Africa, sadly, is that when you do separate migrants and citizens, you get different ways of treating them. It has been encouraging that a lot of NPOs are providing food parcels to immigrants and people in distress. But I'd like to see the government doing more, if it can, with the assistance of the UN, I think, because they do seem to be a bit lost. They fall between the cracks a lot. And there's no doubt that their stories aren't told enough. And I hope that there will be more so. They need more of a voice. So I'm hoping that that voice will be loud enough to be heard, because they do need to have their needs and responded to.
Yes, thank you so much, Mary.
I think the South African context around xenophobia has been critical for on many levels. From a media narrative perspective, I think it's important for journalists to be very mindful of the context in which we report. I think that government has to also make an effort to make sure that this aspect is readily available when information is being given to the media. So it does call for vigilance on both parties involved in the dissemination of news. I think at ground level, particularly regional level, media has to be mindful of the role of the different entities working in the spaces that are not so-called mainframe stories. And therefore we need to be telling these and giving voice to those marginalized communities, especially around the pandemic, the impact, and the triple challenge that's being faced, including poverty being the biggest factor that these communities face.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. William? Do you have anything to say?
I think that that's exactly the job of media at this time, is to be giving a voice and telling the stories of those who are most vulnerable and most in need. And it highlights why the role of journalism is so fundamentally essential. A public broadcaster is called a public broadcaster, not a citizen broadcaster, for a reason. It's therefore the public, which is all people that live within our borders.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Levent, I will skip you, or if you have anything to say, because the question was mainly about South Africa, but you can maybe talk about... Okay, yeah, all right. Thank you then. We have another question that it says that how do you see the curfew regulations in South Africa? Do you see it as a threat that can be extended in the long term? I will go with each panelist for South Africa, but when I come to Levent Kenez, I would like him to answer this question in a global, from a global point of view. William, while we are with you, then let's start from the other way around. Yes, William. So, how do you see the curfew regulations in South Africa? Do you think that it is a threat that can be extended in the long term?
So I guess there are those that will try that. The reality is we've got an outstanding constitution and a constitutional court, and that, in as much as some may attempt that, they won't succeed. Any attempt to do that would be overruled as unconstitutional, which isn't to say that there aren't going to be serious moves to try and limit things, especially around freedom of expression concern. I think that the areas that are most worrying are those that aren't currently regulated. So I'm not too worried about the ones that are, like freedom of expression formally, but the things like the surveillance, the partnerships with mobile operators, and this is a global concern that we've seen, that level of surveillance where people and the state is able to get that level of information and knowledge of where you are and your health criteria, etc. I think that's something that we should be profoundly concerned about after this period now, because we need to make sure that we scale that back. But because it's not regulated and legislated in many instances, that I think is a very clear threat currently.
Thank you so much. I think we are blessed in South Africa in terms of our constitution as well as our justice system and the civil society. Mary?
I think it's a new normal for media, for journalism, and it's back to the drawing board, perhaps a back to basics approach of what this new normal means around the issues of regulation and those areas which are still to be regulated. Again, it calls for deep vigilance, it calls for greater awareness, and it also calls on the public to be conscious of the role that the media is playing. I think support for the media is more relevant and important now more than ever. And fighting for the space for media to operate in is critical in our democracy. And I think that in those of the world, the rest of the world, because what COVID-19 has taught us is that under any circumstances, people depend on the media. And if media is not given the right climate in which to operate in, then we're going to see the consequences of what we see in the rest of the world. So yes, we may be in a relatively free environment, but still to come is those who want to make sure that they can control the narrative, control the space. And William spoke about surveillance. I think those are very real issues that media has to tackle as a whole, working together in a cohesive manner.
Thank you so much. I saw that William raised hand, but I will go to Judy and then I will come back. Oh, it was a mistake. Okay. All right, Judy.
Right. Pretty much most governments try to control their populations more. It seems to be a tendency that is worldwide that they can't resist. And that's why it's important to have strong civil society and justice system, etc. But in relation to extending the curfew, I think we've had strong, good, rational leadership from our president and our health minister. And that's why there's been much more compliance in the first lockdown. But I think if they do some irrational things around extending a curfew when there is no need or if there's no science to back it up, you will find that the population, a lot of them will not be so compliant. And then you will get people, a lot more people, fighting against it, including formal challenges. So I agree with William. You may get some people in government wanting to push the curfew or extend the lack of access to alcohol, which has its pros and cons. Obviously, it's taken a load off the hospitals. There are fewer stabbings on Friday nights from the shebeens, etc. But on the other hand, it's a balance again. It's people's rights to live a normal life, freedom of choice. So it's a very tight balancing act, and governments have to be very careful that they don't overdo the control side, because you will end up with a huge illegal trade, for example, with things that aren't legal anymore, if they try that.
Okay, thank you so much, Judy. Levantinas, I would like to come to you. That I will just change a little bit the question and then to ask you that how do you see the curfew regulations in Europe and in the Middle East? Maybe you can also talk about Turkey as well. And do you see it as a threat that can be extended to long term?
Well, until some countries are applying lockdown, they call it not curfew. Some countries call it curfew, but at the end, you don't allow your citizens to go out. But in some countries, it's so flexible. You can go out, take some time, you do your shopping, you walk in the forest anyway, in the streets. It depends on the country's regulation. In Europe, I don't think that the curfews or lockdowns will extend after the pandemic ends. No, I don't think so. I don't think such a threat. But European institutions must push strongly back these restrictions in the candidate countries and some Eastern countries, because I concern about east of Europe and candidate countries, especially in Turkey. Of course, the authoritarian and totalitarian regimes are so opportunist, so of course they will find a way to extend it after the pandemic. But curfews and lockdowns are very, very strict regulations, very strict restrictions. So I don't think they can handle it. But there's risk, but not too big, according to me.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you so much. We have lots of other questions then in the and also the comments, but I would like to ask, it's just keep coming. I was thinking of taking 3 questions, but let me ask this and then we can decide later on. Why, it says that what South African journalists and people of media can do to help journalists under oppression in different parts of the world in terms of international solidarity. William, can we start from you?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yes.
Sorry. I guess that for ordinary members of the public, the key thing is to support media. Take out subscriptions, support your public broadcaster, and talk about the importance of journalism and freedom of media. In countries that are where there's limited media freedom, they need to stand out. They need to ask their politicians what they're doing about that. You know, they need to be applying pressure on the embassies in the countries where they do have that freedom. So I think that people living in America, for example, should be asking their Turkish ambassador why it is that they choose to release criminals and not media and not journalists. You know, and those calls should be supported by countries like ours and our journalists. I think Mary or Judy made the point earlier that the only way we're going to get through this is to make sure that we stand together with journalists and with media people, because if we don't, the dark forces will win this battle, and then we'll just continue having some redneck lunatics running different countries.
Yes, absolutely. Mary?
I think from a solidarity perspective, what COVID has taught us is that the brick walls and the isolation of countries, of journalists working differently and alone has broken down. From that perspective, I think it's important that there is reach out, particularly, I mean, Levent spoke about what's happening in Europe, what's happening in Turkey. There needs to be a collaboration, an exchange of information far more than ever now. And we also need to be cognizant of the fact that there's no abroad anymore. The global world has just come together, and that makes it a lot easier for tackling the so-called dark forces, to unquote William. So it does mean a stronger working together, a stronger sharing of information. Networking is important now more than ever, and monitoring of the transgressions that's being experienced. For a long time, these kinds of transgressions have been limited to a few watchdog entities. I think now it can become an individual fight, where individual journalists are talking about it, and where the public themselves are being educated and conscientized into what's happening. If we look at the situation in Turkey, for example, we need more of the public outside of Turkey talking about what's happening. In America, we need a lot more of their civil society and their public to be talking about what's happening there. And similarly, I think in the UK, otherwise you will have draconian voices controlling things, and the voice of media will be silent. So there has to be a cohesive working together and a coming together across the global platform.
Absolutely, thank you. Judy?
As Sanif, we do have links with the Committee to Protect Journalists and other organizations, and we put out statements of concern when editors are jailed, or when there's a serious concern, they've been languishing in jail without any charges or anything like that. And Angela Quintal, who is the Africa representative in New York for the Committee to Protect Journalists, is a SANEF member, was on the executive. We have strong links with her, and through her and other organizations, we try to add our voice as the South African National Editors Forum to others who are calling for journalists and editors to be released, and for them to be able to work in safe environments. So we are quite a small band of editors, though. We're not very big. We have quite a few members, but our actual council and executive is quite small. And most of us are volunteers, so we feel passionately, strongly about what we believe in. And I think that is what will carry us all through, that core of passion for justice and fairness and good journalism.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. In fact, Angela was also invited to this online panel, but she couldn't make it, but she wished her success to all of us. And finally, Levent, what is your take on this question?
Well, Attila, when I heard Turkish ambassador from William, I would like to add something. I wrote a piece for a South African newspaper analyzing Turkish case and talking about our colleagues in prison. Turkish ambassador in Pretoria sent a letter to the newspaper. This guy is a terrorist, not a journalist. What I was telling in the piece was that Turkish government is labeling journalists as a terrorist, and how smart is that Turkish ambassador sent a letter to the newspaper that this guy is a terrorist. So just I would like to add, when I heard lady, Madam Ambassador, which is very secular and very modern, westernized woman, but working for the Islamist regime. Anyway.
Yeah. Okay. We have to round up and close. We have more questions, but I just would like to read one of the comments that from Krish Kavanda. He says, Attila, your comment that we should celebrate the freedom that we have in South Africa, protected by our constitution. The media experts should explain where and how there could be a threat to media freedom in South Africa. Oh, this was also kind of a comment in the question. I'm sure that you have a lot to say, but I think this is another maybe another topic that we should maybe separately take this and talk about it. Yes, I mean we all agree. I assume that we are especially when we compare to other countries around the world, especially Africa, where we are quite blessed and lucky that we can say, but of course that in any other country that we also have challenges in South Africa as well, that's for sure. So we have, as I said, lots of questions and comments, but we have to round up and close. It has already been more than hour and a quarter. So I would like to thank all our speakers, all of you and our audience for being our guests and making contribution to our program. Thank you so much. And lastly, I would like to say we all need to understand, as people of the world and people of South Africa, we are all one in this fight against COVID-19. All of us versus the virus. That's that simple. The virus doesn't make separation between rich and poor, black or white or whatever. And we need to learn our lesson from it. We must be united as one human race, and we need to come back to ourselves and remember our responsibilities and duties as human beings. We will work together while protecting the most vulnerable amongst us as well as our planet. And the pandemic is definitely will end for sure, but we must remember that we still have vital problems as humanity. Ignorance, poverty, disunity are still our versus viruses in humanity. We have to be united and support each other on this. We are all the people in South Africa and Africa who still have no access to enough food, proper education, and freedom. We still have a lot to do. That's definitely for sure. Pandemic is teaching us that we have to care one another. If not, these viruses, not only the COVID-19, but all other viruses that we have in the world, in communities, in social communities, will never leave us. And we always be in danger, and we will never be free from the danger. And I just would like to ask to our panelists that if they have anything to say just to close up for half a minute maybe, or 1 minute. If not, that we will close today's program.
Just thank you very much. It's been fascinating, and I've loved listening to the things, and I really enjoy the international perspective to it as well. It's also important to put us in a broader context. And thank you very much for organizing this and support our media, support media freedom.
Thank you.
Combat disinformation.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Mary.
And thank you so much. It's been absolutely stimulating to listen to colleagues we know and colleagues we don't know, and sharing information around this very important time. I think Judy mentioned what SANEF's doing. There's also going to be research into the impact of COVID-19, particularly around the business aspect of it, and the information from that will be released soon to South Africa. But on the whole, we need to be talking more and having lots more discussions around all matters media freedom. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. Judy?
Thank you for the opportunity, Attila. It's been really great to share ideas and experiences. And I want to say to every person who's listening or watching, look after your eyes and ears. In other words, look after your journalists. They are your eyes and ears, and you need them. We need them. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Judy. Levent, anything you have to say lastly?
As a last word, I would like to salute all our colleagues who were killed or languishing behind bars on this important day. Our prayers are with them, and I would like to express my sympathy to them. Thank you for this opportunity, and I thank my colleagues. It was great to be with them.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining our program and for your input. Before I close up, I would like to remind that this program will also be on our Universal Rights Association YouTube channel. So please go and subscribe to URA YouTube channel and follow URA on Facebook, on Twitter and Instagram at URAS Africa, and check the website, which is www.uniras.org. Until next time, take care of yourself and take care of the others. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Stay safe.